Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organization create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your hosts, Mark Bidwell and Roddy Miller.
I hope you enjoyed last week's show with Mark Vollenweider of EvalueServe. We've had some really good feedback about the episode, and it's well worth a listen or indeed download the transcript to read if you haven't got to it yet. This week I talked to Larry Cunningham, who was handpicked by Warren Buffett to catalogue and organise Berkshire Hathaway's famous annual reports. He's recently written the definitive book on the corporate culture of Berkshire Hathaway, called Berkshire Beyond Buffett. I've personally followed this company for almost 2 decades, including making the annual pilgrimage to the AGM in Omaha, which I highly recommend. I've also used some of Warren and Charlie's principles, such as the concept of moats, to develop business strategies that build and maintain competitive advantage over the long term. Larry and I explore this idea in the context of some of the Berkshire operating units, as well as the relationship between autonomy and performance, what being an entrepreneur means in the Berkshire ecosystem, and how Larry thinks Berkshire will work with the Brazilian private equity firm 3G in the future. Hello and welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. With me today is Larry Cunningham, who's a prolific author and lecturer on a broad range of business-related topics and is also a chaired professor of law and business at George Washington University. His books include The Essays of Warren Buffett, Lessons for Corporate America, and Berkshire Beyond Buffett, The Enduring Value of Values. He's written for the Financial Times, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and has appeared on CNBC, Fox, and NPR. Welcome to the show, Larry.
Delighted to be here, Mark. Thanks so much.
So, when and how did you become interested in Buffett and Berkshire?
About 25 years ago, so that would be, early 1990s. In my practice in corporate governance and in my research, I started to encounter Warren Buffett's writings, and I found them to be just strikingly lucid, compelling, and totally against what everyone else sort of thought and knew. So it looked like sort of a researcher's goldmine. And so I began reading and digesting the information, and it just suddenly became clear to me that we had a very special company, a very special leadership, a very special personality that deserved much more attention than it had been given. Back 25 years ago, Warren was not the household name he'd become in the last 2 decades, and so I found that his ideas were very important but undervalued, and so I began to systematically examine them.
And lots been written about him, as you say. He is a household name, but there hasn't been a huge amount about Berkshire as an institution. Although, of course, if you go to Omaha for the annual general meeting, which I think is at the end of this month, you do get a sense of what you get a sense of the culture. But as you started for your most recent book, the Berkshire Beyond Buffett book, you did a lot of work on interviewing executives in the 50-plus subsidiaries that characterize the Berkshire business. What surprised you most as you started interacting with these executives?
Well, how much autonomy they really do have. That's I think the most peculiar feature of the Berkshire system, and even as one hears about it and hears about the talk of being a decentralized organization where the CEOs of the operating units have discretion to make all operational decisions, to hear about it is one thing. To actually sit down with these men and women who execute on a daily basis and talk about how free they are and how they get to decide basically whether they want to talk to Warren or not, how often they want to report, when they need to clear things with him. It's an amazingly decentralized system, and that's the thing that surprised me most. And I'd just add to the point that you made that there's been an enormous amount of study and attention given to Warren Buffett, the person, and his particular investment strategies. The style of value investing, the idea of focusing on good businesses at reasonable prices, and so on. An enormous amount has been written about that. because Warren's been doing that for 50 years. Far less has been written about Berkshire as a company and its corporate culture and these principles that you're developing and discussing. And it's partly because Berkshire has only been practicing that for a decade or two. So it's a rich field to plow, and I think we've only all just begun to do it.
So, I mean, say a bit more about that. Berkshire's only been practicing it for the last for a decade or so. Because, I mean, one of the things that's clear in your book is that there's a shift from it being an investment company to being a holding company. And I think now, 20% of the business is public investments and the 80% are operating businesses. Is that what you mean by that that comment around them only starting to practice this methodology more recently?
Yes. I mean, so 20 years ago, 25 years ago, as you said, Berkshire was a $5 billion company or $10 billion company, but 80% of its assets were in investments, marketable securities like Coca-Cola, Wells Fargo, ABC, Cap Cities, the Washington Post. So it had sizable minority stakes. But what Warren was famous for was having selected these investments and having monitored them, and his approach to analyzing businesses. But at that point, Berkshire had only acquired 100% of maybe 10 or so companies, and they were relatively small. Certainly, Warren had practiced this idea of that you're sort of the ecosystem, the decentralized approach, but it had not been consequential. In the past 20 years, Berkshire has generated so much excess cash, so much free cash flow, free capital, that it has acquired 50 wholly owned subsidiaries and organized them and operated them in this way. And it's been a spectacular success and a huge achievement, and the company is now, ought to be thought of far more as a conglomerate, and he ought to be studied far more for his management style than seen as merely an investment vehicle, and him being mostly important for his skill at picking investments. And yeah, that's what I mean. So he's been a skilled investor and a studied investor for nearly 50 years. He has assembled this conglomerate and has achieved this managerial record only really in the last 15 or 20 years, depending on how you count. So I think the record is sufficiently complete that we can say it's a very successful model as he has designed it. But the record isn't long enough for it to have attracted the robust following and emulators and so on that the investment record had done.
And it's interesting because, I mean, I'm sure there are a number of listeners here who are, leading or executives in large public companies who are dealing with quarterly challenge, earnings expectations from Wall Street. And yet you've got executives who are giving, as you said, who've given this enormous amount of autonomy. And I think Charlie Munger, the vice chairman, says it stops just short of abdication. This concept of giving them the space they need. I mean, what does it actually look like? So, any examples of a conversation you had with an executive in one of the subsidiaries? What does this autonomy really mean for them? Give it up against the context of perhaps some of our listeners who are, as I say, dealing with investor relations challenges on an ongoing basis. I mean, how can you just characterize those two extremes, if you like, if indeed they are extremes?
Yeah, I do think that the senior executive in a public company faces pressure from the analyst community and from sort of the securities world that wants to know what the quarterly looks like and what the target for the next half and the final year is. And there's enormous pressure to at least forecast and very often to deliver results on that time frame, on that schedule. It's very often someone else's schedule because your business doesn't necessarily operate that way. You might need longer lead times. You might need to correct through a cycle or take time to push price increases through, and it just may not work out in a 3, 6, 12-month sort of operation. And so you get a conflict sometimes between what you'd really like to do and what you really feel constrained to do by that external pressure. At Berkshire Hathaway, the directive from the CEO, from headquarters, from Warren, is to ignore that kind of external constraint. If your business cycle operates in a 24-month program or 19-month or some sort of scattershot, that's okay. You need to work through a period to make adjustments or to make an acquisition, to digest an acquisition, and so you've got some hiccups and so on in your performance and your earnings. That's okay. As long as you're working through and working towards a satisfactory objective over multiple yearly periods, that's fine. And so it's a world of difference, and it can happen that nice way in other private companies too. But it is notable that Berkshire itself is a public company, and it has followers who look for results on relatively short periods, and so Buffett has to resist a little bit of that. But he does it by avoiding quarterly conference calls and that sort of thing, and has educated a group of investors who appreciate looking out over multiple periods, not just single year periods. And so an individual person at one of the subsidiaries, take MyTech, the maker of industrial roofing components. They make acquisitions all the time. Sometimes they immediately are accretive to earnings. Sometimes it takes time to digest and work through. And he doesn't have to account every single quarter, every single year for how that performance is going, but rather over a 5-year period, what have we been building? What have we been delivering? And so, and nor does he have to report on acquisitions over certain sizes. He feels constrained to report to Buffett, but or acquisitions that are a little farther afield than its ordinary business, add-ons and bolt-ons and things like that. But it's fairly discretionary, and it's the bottom line over multiple periods of time that matter, not particular business decisions or the results that they achieve. So it's a totally radically different culture, and and it's based on trust, obviously. To give a manager that kind of leeway and that kind of rolling time frame, you've got to have people who are going to be able to discharge that responsibility faithfully over those long periods of time, and not be slackers and or line their own pockets or so on. So you need to get trustworthy people in those positions. You need to have a culture in which being trusted fosters reciprocity, so that when Warren says, you've got a lot of leeway here, that person says, well, I'm really going to discharge that responsibility faithfully. And I guess to give you an example, that is the most striking thing. I talked to Bruce Whitman, who's the CEO of Flight Safety, which is Berkshire's subsidiary that trains pilots. And he said, basically, the way that Warren treats me, I feel like this money is my money, and so I do with this money. It's Berkshire's money, but I treat it as if it's my own. And when you do it that way, you're much more careful about deploying capital effectively, avoiding excess costs, and otherwise acting as a faithful steward of capital. And so that's the culture. And to create it, you need that leadership from a guy like Buffett, speaking in those terms and then acting by giving power to the leadership teams that can actually execute, and then having those people feel like that responsibility of receiving trust compels a commitment to honor that trust, and it works. There are exceptions. There are some people who have been given responsibility who breached it and who failed and who had to leave, and so there are costs to the system. But if on balance, if you're able to assemble a large group like this and create a culture where trust is the most important thing, the cost will be minor in relation to the gains.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the people who are who choose to sell their businesses to Berkshire are entrepreneurs themselves. They built up their businesses. There are lots of rags to riches stories in the book. I'm interested for the people further down the organization, so what I'd call the intrapreneurs, so the innovators within these organizations. What does it feel like? Would they talk in the same way that you've talked about, that the chief executives of these subsidiaries might talk about, in terms of levels of autonomy, the freedom to think about their role in terms of using their own money versus someone else's money? And that's an analogy I used in Syngenta, where every time we were faced with a difficult business decision, I'd ask the team, if this was your family's money, how would you actually choose to spend it? 'Cause it's a nice way of getting people to get completely committed to the decision making. But what does it mean? What's it mean to be an intrapreneur in one of these subsidiaries? Any views on that?
Yeah, I do think that corporate cultures tend to self-propagate and proliferate across and down an organization. So what I mean is, when Berkshire makes an acquisition, it doesn't necessarily look for a company that has that same kind of decentralized structure. But it just so happens that the people that Warren feels like he can trust have tended to structure their businesses along the same line, so that they've got a bunch of people in their organization all the way down throughout it that they can trust. And so while any Berkshire subsidiary can, because of that autonomy, the CEO can organize that subsidiary however he or she wants. The tendency that I saw across those subsidiaries repeatedly was to have that same attitude of delegation, autonomy, decentralization, so that a good, I could give you a dozen examples, but that company, MyTech, that I was just talking about, that's the construction engineering roof manufacturing company. They make, I think they've made 50 or so acquisitions since Berkshire bought it about 10 or 12 years ago. And they approach it the exact same way. When they go out and make an acquisition, they tell the seller, you will have a permanent home here at MyTech. You will have total autonomy to run your business, whatever it is, making brick facades or curtain walls for skyscrapers or whatever it is, roof trusses. You'll be able to run your business just as you have, without much or any interference from us. We'll be here when you need us, but you will have the ability to innovate. You're the person who knows best, in your market, what you should be doing, what changes you should make, what pitches you should make, what customers you should seek, what bids you ought to calculate, and so on. So we're going to let you do it. And I think that that's true across most of the Berkshire subsidiaries, that the CEOs, and again, another example came from Frank Paddock, who's the chairman and CEO of the Marmon Group, which is one of the top 10 largest Berkshire subsidiaries. He told me that his company has always been highly decentralized, and it's a large conglomerate itself with 10 different industrial lines. And he says, it's so big and complicated, there's no way that I could participate in the day-to-day decision-making of all of those units. And so I've got presidents of each of them, and they call all their own shots. And they have the long time horizon that Berkshire gives Marmon. And so it is a bit of a replica of Berkshire. So, but as Munger has repeatedly said, is we don't insist that our subsidiaries have any particular governance structure. So there may be some variation out there, but by and large, the subsidiaries that I looked at closely tended to share the values that Berkshire stood for, including this one of trying to push power and decision making down to the place where the people have the best knowledge and the greatest incentive to get it right, rather than having declarations and bulletins from the C-suite down to the operational execution level.
Yeah. So, I guess as you walked around these businesses, it sounds like they just felt very, very different from the more traditional, publicly quoted, hierarchical, structured corporations that many of us might be familiar with.
Yeah, that is the general pattern at Berkshire, and part of it is in fact that say they've made 50 acquisitions in the last 25 years. Just roughly off the top of my head, probably 40 or so of them have been private companies, and so they purchase publicly traded companies. That's fine, but I think the culture that they're looking for, the kind of leadership they're looking for, the kind of market positioning, the kind of attitude and stuff like that is going to congregate in the private sector, where they've been able to operate, without the kind of pressure of quarterly conference calls and earnings expectations and that sort of thing. So, and I'm just sitting here thinking about the companies in the Berkshire landscape. I think the ones that have been private tend to mimic the Berkshire style more clearly and closely than the ones that had been public, where I think you just have a little more bureaucracy built in, just partly because of legal requirements, internal controls and things like that. So, but within the population of public companies, I think that those that have sold to Berkshire and then have part of Berkshire are probably the most loosely organized and the more streamlined, the more entrepreneurial, if you like. And so, but that I think is what, part of what Berkshire is looking for, part of what it gets.
Okay, so can we switch to innovation, this subject? Because, Berkshire or Buffett talks a lot about moats, these sources of competitive advantage, and many listeners are working in businesses where their moats are getting smaller and shallower. And I'm thinking of, regulated long product life cycle companies that could perhaps be threat of Uberization or threat of changing consumer demand. And moats at some point in time, they look unassailable. So think Kodak, think BlackBerry, think Nokia, and very quickly it turns out that they weren't quite as unassailable as they just disappeared. And the two questions here that I'm really interested in. I mean, firstly, do executives talk about moats in some of the subsidiaries? Because the reason I ask that is that there are companies in the group like Geico, for instance, which potentially is the moat is getting smaller and smaller as the threat of self-driving cars becomes more and more real. So, how do people talk in terms of moats, and how are these conversations evolving? Given the fact that you can't open the newspaper these days without hearing about or reading about fintech or disruption in very mature industries.
Yes, I heard that word moat and across the subsidiaries, the CEOs I talked to and the senior people at various companies and some of the directors, they certainly all know the word moat and often use it expressly. And even if they don't use that particular word, they're certainly talking in terms of competitive advantages and the capacity to fend off rivals and also onslaughts from technological change and so on. So it's something. It's part of the vocabulary. Maybe it's part of the DNA. And I do think it's something that is important when Berkshire considers an acquisition. It evaluates the company's capacity to sustain its prosperity over decades rather than shorter periods, and that's all about detecting a competitive advantage. And I'd say most of the Berkshire companies exhibit that strength, and over relatively long periods of time. Some of them have succumbed and have been beaten, and others are fighting. I think the most conspicuous example of that is a company called The Pampered Chef.
Yeah, okay.
Right? It was a $1 billion acquisition for Berkshire about 15 or so years ago. It now is worth quite less.
Yeah.
We don't have micro data on exactly what it's worth, but its earnings are probably. I think 15 years ago it might have been earning 400 or 500 million. Today it might be 30 or 40.
And that was the internet that basically the direct sales model was broken by the internet. Is that right?
Exactly. I mean, they had these in-house home parties where neighbors sold spatulas and pans to people, and it's a very quaint, lovely, old-fashioned model. But that's not how people buy things anymore. And so that company. It was great when it was bought, but it has not prospered since. It's got a lot of problems, and I don't know if they're going to be able to turn it around. They'd really have to soup up their internet presence, and that's not an easy thing to do, especially when the gadgetry can all be procured by Amazon and sold directly out there. So that business model, it may be unsustainable, unrevivable. A couple other companies, in the early days, even not that long ago, Berkshire bought apparel manufacturers, shoe companies that manufactured products in the United States right at the time when it became really cheap to move goods across seas and to pay low wages from places from Honduras to Singapore. And so those companies got crushed, and they picked up the remnants and tried to sustain what parts they could by focusing on products that sell well when they're made in America, like army boots and uniforms and things, or that have to be made in America under municipal laws for like police uniforms and things like that. They were able to sort of salvage a bit of moat, a bit of advantage, but a large part of it was just eroded by those onslaughts. On the other side, I think some companies they still have are facing that kind of problem. Fruit of the Loom is, they make underwear. They've got a branded advantage, and they're sort of low cost because they're made elsewhere. But it's not as if that's some thick, durable moat full of crocodiles and alligators. The Garanimals brand is a smaller company, but likewise, it's an apparel manufacturer and toy maker for children's lines. And it's got a nice, moat in the sense that it's been really successful in carving out a place where parents feel really comfortable educating their children using the products and stuff like that. So it's got some leadership, but in terms of manufacturing costs and so on, it's not there at the edge. On the other side, you've got a company like take Lubrizol, which makes petroleum products and additives. It's got a real moat. It's got knowledge, scientists, chemists, products, history, reputation, just an enormous capacity to help its clients in the automotive sector and just about every aspect of it, manufacturers, users of products, regulators. So, it's constantly innovating. It's constantly on the edge. It's constantly testing products and helping companies make better products. So, it's constantly trying to be out there, constantly trying to develop new applications for its products. It's participating in making plastic money. Instead of having currency made of paper, many central banks are thinking about making it plastic, and how would that work? And Lubrizol is very much involved in that. I mean, BNSF Railway, just take one of the giant companies. They're a leader but just because of scale and consolidation in the North American rail industry. There still may be a little bit of consolidation to come, but they're a power player in that space. But they got to compete not just against the other couple of railroads, but also against the trucking industry. And so, how do they do that? They try to be cheaper, cleaner, faster, more flexible, and they're able to do that in part because they're constantly on the edge of technology too, using logistics engineering and computerized traffic networks and stuff. And so, they're out there fighting. They're fighting for their market share. They're fighting for their, profitability. But, I think they do pretty well. Your Geico example is an interesting one, because I do think that the automotive insurance industry is facing some change, like most industries are. And what their moat has historically been being a low-cost supplier of a commodity product with great advertising budget that backs it up and pretty good customer service. And so that package has served them well. They've gradually increased market share over the past 25 or 30 years from 2 or 3% to 10 or 12%. They have very high premium volume. It's growing. They usually have underwriting profits. Occasionally they hit some bumps. They return any excess profits to customers in the form of low premiums. So they've got a moat. So long as there's an automotive industry, insurance market for cars, I think they'll have a good share of it, and they're probably pushing on and on. I think the development of the driverless car is, it's a potential. It's an incipient threat to the moat, but I think that that technology is hardly proven and will evolve and develop, and we may get a transplant. But I still think there's going to be a role. They're going to be, at least from the limited testing that we've seen, the driverless car is not going to be accident free. There are going to be problems, and somebody's going to have to pay for them. And so we're going to need to develop a risk allocation system. And it's not going to be, may not be the kind of thing we're used to. Geico and its rivals will participate in shaping it, and so they'll have a forward advantage, I think, in designing whatever that is. So it may look different, but I think they've got the capacity, the leadership, and the edge to try to shape it and still be a leader, maybe even be a bigger leader than they have been. So, but they all face this. You're absolutely right. All these companies, and and some of them do better than others. And I mean, Benjamin Moore Paint's another one. I mean, they manufacture paint. They've faced a lot of adversity. I mean, the big sort of challenge of them was that when Berkshire bought it in 2000, most paint was bought in stores run by moms and pops in Middle America. But then, right then, it was the enormous expansion of the big box retailers like Walmart and Kmart, and especially Home Depot and places like that started to build these huge cavernous like warehouse type facilities with enormous supplies of paint and other hardware, and people started buying from them. And Warren and Benjamin Moore had never sold through those kinds of stores, had only sold through their authorized local dealer network. And when Buffett bought Benjamin Moore, he made a personal promise that he would retain that distribution system. Well, in the last 15 years, especially during the 08, 09, post-household crisis, I mean, it was very hard to sell paint at all. And where it was getting sold was in Home Depot and these big box retailers. And so it became very difficult to sustain the Benjamin Moore business model. But you couldn't back out of it because Berkshire and Buffett made a promise. So, that's threading a needle, what they've managed to do. And they went through a couple of CEOs. I mean, this unusual at Berkshire. We currently have the third, Mike Searles is the third CEO, in the past 10 years, the fourth CEO since Berkshire bought it, which is very unusual. Because again, you want to give these guys autonomy and let them call the shots, and they mostly do. But in Benjamin Moore's case, two of the CEOs said, "Look, I have to figure out a way to sell through the big tops. And so they did a little experiment in Canada, and when Warren heard about it, he went furious, and these guys left. So the current CEO, what he's trying to do, he said, what is our moat? What's our advantage, and how can we capitalize that on? We cannot sell paint at Home Depot, but what can we do about our local authorized dealership retailers? And what they've done is just plant the flag on that and go out and tell everybody that we are the only paint manufacturer that solely sells through your local authorized dealer, who can give you far better service, really think about what the right paint for your home is, working with interior decorators to win their trust and custom, to be the referral and the go-to. And so they're sort of making silk out of cows' ears, right? And that's I think it's too early to be sure if Michael is able to thread that and is able to really sustain that as the moat. But that's kind of one way to do it. So what is our strength? And let's build as best we can on that.
So I mean, I suppose lots of listeners don't work for Warren Buffett and his organizations. I think they got 300,000 people. So there are lots of listeners of the show who aren't part of the Buffett ecosystem. What advice would you give to them around to leaders, for instance, who are setting the cultures of these organizations, around how to think about disruption, how to think about innovation in the context of these shifts in industry that are changing the rules of engagement, if you like, in some of these marketplaces?
Yeah, I do think an organizational structure that is designed to promote innovation and protect those kinds of moats is the wise one. That is pushing responsibility for detection and response or anticipation of disruptive onslaught down to the people who are on the front lines, right? The people, take Benjamin Moore. I want to know, the person on Main Street selling those products. What is she seeing? What's happening? And being in touch with, the 2,000 of those people around the country and making sure that they participate in the decision-making process, whether it's the mixture, the texture, the colors, the supply chain, the speed, whatever it is that we can do to maintain that decision-making is going to be, or at least the knowledge and information is going to be coming from that area. And so, Mike Searles, the CEO, it was probably wise to get as much input and give as much autonomy and power down to those people about where should they set up their shops, what inventory should they carry, how should they mix the paints and so on like that. And so I think this principle to maintain moats, it's most likely going to be coming from the ground up rather than from the C-suite down. So I think these principles of decentralization, of trust, of another one we haven't really discussed too much, but animates Berkshire is a sense of self-reliance. That who is responsible, and that's everybody down the chain, and that every person ought to be able to rely on themselves and empowered to do that, and then responsible and accountable. If they do well, to be rewarded. If they fail, to be let go or punished or so on, or deprived of rewards, of internal rewards. So these principles of autonomy and empowerment, I think that those principles are an important factor, and then sort of the practices to get them down there are the tone at the top, the statements of formal managerial structure of governance that is more about trust than about internal control. That's more about rewarding innovation, spontaneous response, and rather than sluggishness that appreciates generating funds internally rather than borrowing them. That appreciates that making acquisitions is sometimes a process that takes time to prove out. So I think those principles and those practices can be injected. I mean, a lot of people debate whether Berkshire is so special because Warren is so special that it can't be replicated and there's not much to learn and it's not worth emulating. And I don't think any of us should be foolish enough to believe that any of us could design or create the next Berkshire Hathaway on that scale or with that level of success. But I think there's no question that many of the principles and practices that they stand for are proven and that are well adaptable to many other organizations. So and that they've got a very strong logic and very strong basis. I mean, all of the empirical literature and behavioral psychology in the workforce attests to the fact that people perform better when they're given responsibility and when they are trusted and they have power in an organization. People do tend to stand up and act on it. And, autonomy is, more value enhancing than control. I mean, ask a person, at the cash register, if they're more likely to try to achieve this result for the organization. They will more likely do that if they're trusted to do it rather than directed to do it, if they're able to do it in a way that makes sense rather than to check a bunch of forms that show that they complied with the policy. So there's a strong basis in empirics and logic and policy for all this. And again, the payoffs are huge. I mean, you have sustaining your moat, lower cost of administration, lower cost of capital allocation, lower cost of acquisitions. A big point to make at this moment is that, you referred to those sellers of companies to Berkshire Hathaway who tend to be entrepreneurial. Well, they are indeed, and they value retaining that autonomy when they join Berkshire, and so they are willing to sell to Berkshire at a lower price than rivals, right? So that's just a great advantage if you are leading or building a company like this. If you can really develop this kind of reputation for legitimate, genuine trusting of your managers and giving them leeway, you're going to be able to buy companies at a discount. And but the final point I just make on this passage is what's vital in this community, in this culture, is the ability to trust. That is the trustworthiness of the people. It's a big cost, in other words, is that you will invariably make mistakes and have irresponsible miscreants, acting out of self-interest rather than out of the organization's interest. And, you do have to weigh that. Berkshire has plenty of examples of people that line their own pockets instead of acting for the company. But again, if you can incubate the right culture, those mistakes are going to be few and far between and be, net minor
Yep.
costs in the overall.
So, one final question before we start to wrap this up, Larry. You talked about their ability to attract the best type of seller, someone who had similar values, but also potentially might do a transaction at a slightly lower price. How has this changed with one of what I see as probably the most significant innovation in this model, which is getting into bed with 3G and some of the transactions they've done recently, which I think have. Subsequent to the transactions, the very aggressive cost cutting is totally at odds with with what it meant to be bought by Berkshire in the past. And secondly, going forward, I think Buffett has said this is potentially going to be a model that we're going to use more of. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the critics have a point that this is not what Berkshire has done and not what it stands for. Warren's, that is to buy companies and deliberately, downsize and squeeze new efficiencies out of them. And, Warren's response has been, well, we never have deliberately maintained a bloated payroll at Berkshire Hathaway. And that's fair enough, but it's really only a partial response because nor have they ever gone out and deliberately acquired a company with a bloated workforce and then proceeded to save costs by cutting it. Berkshire does not look for companies that are inefficient. They look for them that are already well managed. So it is a very different acquisition model for Berkshire Hathaway. My defense, and so I would discourage Berkshire from continuing to do this kind of thing. My defense of what they've done, and I don't know that Warren has exactly put it this way, is to draw a sharp distinction between what we began with in this phone call, that a sharp distinction between wholly owned companies and minority owned companies, right? Historically, Berkshire bought McDonald's and ExxonMobil and Walmart and what have you, and it was not responsible for the day-to-day decision-making of those companies, the policies they'd had, who they hire, who they fire, whether they have a downsizing, whether they have a consolidation or anything like that. And it wasn't, Berkshire wasn't able to control those outcomes or those decisions, but it was not, and so he didn't get a black eye, didn't deserve a black eye if McDonald's did this or Coke did that. Whereas with its 100% owned subsidiaries, it is responsible. It is responsible for the treatment of customers, suppliers, workers, and the effects on communities and taxation and so on. So I draw a sharp distinction between those two, and I would locate these 3G acquisitions, the one of Heinz first, and then the On acquisition of of Kraft as more like those minority positions rather than the wholly owned positions. And my support for that is precisely that in the contract between Berkshire and 3G about the ownership, 3G has whole operational autonomy. So they're just like, a Coke or a Wells Fargo or another investee. And so they make decisions to downsize and cut and do these other kind of LBO private equity type things. That's really their decision, and it's not really a Berkshire decision. And that's how I'd defend it. And then I'd say, look, and what we will do from the Berkshire holders' perspective, what is attractive about this, and from Berkshire's cultural perspective, is if 3G, after the end of 7 years, the term of the preferred stock that Berkshire owns, has been able to render Kraft or Heinz into a Berkshire-type company. So it doesn't have a bloated payroll, and it's got these other qualities about autonomy and decentralization and trust and so on. Then Berkshire can buy. It will be a Berkshire company. Berkshire can exercise its option to buy the other half that it doesn't own, and then it will continue to be fully responsible for the treatment of the employees and suppliers and customers and so on, and can do so in a traditional Berkshire way. But if Heinz is not like that, or Kraft is not like that, Berkshire can sell. And that would not violate any Berkshire principle. Berkshire has always been free under its internal principles to sell common stocks whose economic characteristics deteriorate. It has rarely or nearly never sold a wholly owned subsidiary, and it pledges not to do so. So that's how I would analyze it. I don't think that the partnerships are the best idea they've had. But if properly understood, they're consistent with Berkshire's history, practice, and philosophy, and should not impair its ability to say to prospective sellers, we treat businesses that we buy, with autonomy and respect and so on. And so that's how I would size it up.
That's fair enough. No, very good. So wrapping this up, Larry, I sent 3 questions through to you. If we can just very quickly go through those. Your morning rituals.
Yes, well, I'm an early riser. I like to get up early. I try to read 3 newspapers every day, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the FT. I don't always get through all 3 of them, but I like at least headlines and at least the first few paragraphs of each of them to get a sense. These writers are, they're independent journalists trying to be objective, but they tend to have a little different take on things. So I feel like I get the fuller version of the main stories when I have a glance at least at all 3. So I love doing that, and then I always try to take a run or have some kind of exercise in the early parts of the day, because it's just a great way to ignite the brain activity. I've had so many of my better ideas when running, and then the day's off to a good start. And also as part of the routine, most days I do a considerable amount of writing in the morning, all the way up to lunchtime, and on the good days I get more writing done by lunch than many people get done in a week. So those are my ambitions for most mornings.
Excellent. Second question, what have you changed your mind about recently?
Well, the most consequential change of mind that I made, depends, the word recently might be funny, but it was about 10 years ago. That might be recent or not. But I made a decision. I had been married once and divorced, and I just planned on leaving that part of life behind. And my eldest brother, sitting at a dinner with my nephew, said, "Larry, the best thing in life is being married and having children." And so I changed my mind. I opened my heart. I ended up finding a wife, and we've got 2 beautiful girls. And it was and my brother was right. So that's probably the most important change of mind I've ever had in my whole life, and probably the most important one to share with people.
Yep. No, very good, very good. Well, we could spend an hour on that question, because this is something that Charlie Munger talks a lot about the need to, reassess some of your assumptions on a regular basis, because we inherit them and we don't necessarily test them as frequently as we should do. So that's very good. Thanks for that. And then finally, what advice would you have for your 25-year-old self?
Right. That's a great one. I think it's to appreciate that your first job is probably not going to be your only job. And that was true 25 years ago, and I think it's even more true today, that very few people stay in their first job for the rest of their careers. It sometimes happens, but I'd stress to people that it's an important job. It's an important first step, but that very likely you're going to make some switches and changes along the way. Sometimes you might even You might even change careers, as I did. I started out as a corporate lawyer. I became a law professor. I got into finance and investing and consulting. And so I've just had many different kind of iterations in my career, most of it all cumulative. So I keep learning and bringing the old skills to the new assignments and so on. So, but I think keeping that in mind as a 25-year-old, if you think of yourself as just a corporate lawyer or just an investment banker or just an investment analyst or just a security officer, whatever it is, I think you might shortchange yourself. I think you should appreciate that you're in this job now. Do the absolute immaculate best you can, but always be ready to take what you learned to new places and to new firms, new careers, and new horizons.
Excellent, very good. Yeah, that's a common theme actually with previous guests who've made similar comments. Where can people get in touch with you, Larry?
Well, they can visit my website, BerkshireBeyondBuffett.com. It's got a lot of information about the book that you so kindly brought to their attention. And feel free also, your viewers can feel free to send me an email. It's Cunningham at law.gwu.edu. And mention that you heard me talk with Mark on the show. And
we'll put those in the show notes. And of course, I guess the obvious thing is that they can go to Omaha at the end of this month, and you're going to be there, right?
I'm going to be in Omaha. Yeah, I've been there most times over the past 20 or so years, and I'll be giving a couple different presentations. And be at book signings at various places. So I'll be at the Bookworm during the annual meeting, at lunch, in the exhibit hall, signing books, and I'll also be on a panel on Friday afternoon at Creighton University. They every year for many years they have a value investing panel. I've been on it a couple of times. I'm looking forward to being there again. That's at Creighton University on Friday from 3 to 5, and I'll be signing books there. I've got a new book coming out that's a annotated transcript of the symposium I did with Warren and Charlie 20 years ago, where we launched the essays, and that's going to be a fun little product, and it's going to debut at the meeting this year.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put all this in the show notes, and it's been a great pleasure having you on the show, Larry. I'm looking forward to meeting you face to face. I can't make it to Omaha this year, but let's keep in touch, and I'm sure our audience will have enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks very much for your time.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks very much indeed, Mark. I look forward to catching up again soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
So lots of great insights here from my conversation with Larry, and for anyone interested, I highly recommend the book Berkshire Beyond Buffett, as well as the most recent Berkshire annual report, which I promise you is not like any other annual report you'll ever have read. Of course, there's lots of speculation about the future of this $350 billion market cap company after Warren and Charlie are gone. People are also asking how some of the businesses will fare in the face of changes in demographics, consumer tastes and technology. And Larry responds to this question referring to two businesses, the Pampered Chef and Geico, that are right in the firing line of some of these trends and potentially at risk. But stepping back, it's clear to me that all businesses and their owners and their operators can learn from what Warren and Charlie have built. The focus on reputation, on avoiding lavish spending, on efficient capital allocation, and on giving entrepreneurs and leaders the space and autonomy to build and run their businesses all makes perfect sense. But of course, we let emotions such as ego and envy get in the way, as well as focus far too much on the short term. Next week, Roddy talks to Stephen D'Souza, the director of Deeper Learning Limited, based in London. He talks about the importance of not knowing, of going to the edges of our knowledge and beyond, as a key behaviour of leaders and individuals trying to make themselves and their organisations more innovative and more entrepreneurial. And I should say this is our 10th episode of the series, and both Roddy and I have learned a lot. We've had lots of great feedback, and we've had enormous support from our partners who are helping us with the production, which is Harry and Addy. I'd like to thank Sarah and Chobo on technology, and Holger and his team on those wonderful visualizations that so many of you comment on and like. And if you like this episode, please go over to our website, innovationecosystem.com. Where you can download the transcript, you can see the show notes, and you can also sign up for our newsletter. And of course, if you like this episode, please do go onto iTunes and give us a review. It does make a big difference, and we do want to hear from you, as well as to get our work out into the innovation ecosystem for executives and entrepreneurs alike to benefit from. Thanks again for your time, and have a great week.